Good morning. Thank you very much for coming out for this morning's Leadership Institute breakfast, wake-up breakfast. It's good to see you all this early in the morning. I'm not Morton Blackwell. Morton is in London teaching folks how to raise monies a different way than our later speaker will be describing is done in Washington. I'm Denny Doherty, the first vice president, and we're very glad to have you here. Since 1979, Leadership Institute has trained over 93,248, most of them conservatives, 1,980 this year alone already in 2011. You have at your seat a schedule of the schools that are being that are scheduled for this year. As you can see, we've got something for everybody. Come back more than once, and increase your effectiveness as an advocate for your beliefs. I have the pleasure of introducing, for the purpose of the invocation and Pledge of Allegiance, Marcy LeBlanc. Marcy is the Director of Planned Giving for the Development Department at the Leadership Institute. She's one of my favorite people, a Cajun with a University of Mississippi education. She studied English and political science there, and Marcy, will you come up, please, and get us started off on the right foot?
Good morning. I was a true rebel, and thank you for pronouncing my name correctly. Appreciate it. Please bow your heads and join me for a quick prayer. Lord, we come to you with thanksgiving for this spring season. We pray for our troops and their families that you would continue to protect them, and Father, that they will see your grace. Lord, we pray blessing and wisdom over our speaker, Congressman Price. And Father, we pray for our nation, that you would continue to shed a light on your truth, especially to those who follow and serve you. Father, continue to bless those who fight for the freedom that you sent your son to die for. And Father, we just bless Morton and the LI staff with safe travels. And Lord, we bless this food to the nourishment of our bodies. In your name we pray. Amen. Please stand and join me for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Okay, I next have the pleasure of introducing Chris Doss. Chris is a grassroots trainer for the Leadership Institute, has been an adjunct lecturer and presenter at 36 college and university campuses, as well as think tanks, public affairs institutions, seminars, workshops, both in the United States and abroad. To introduce our speaker, Chris Doss.
Thank you very much, but I am going to defer to Chris Malagese before I do that. Is he here? Chris is not here. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce a man whom I thought I knew a lot about. I thought he was a Georgian from Michigan, and I have just learned in talking, he has been elevated from a pedestal to a grand monument this morning, as I have discovered that he is actually a Virginian and an Edmonds, and I have had to eat my breakfast with the Chris Matthews shivering leg. And Edmonds from Virginia, his family is from Roanoke. Now you have to wonder also how an esteemed physician, an osteopathic surgeon from Georgia, would join, if I may misquote Mark Twain, America's only indigenous set of criminals, the Congress of the United States. But we have a gentleman in our midst who has seen what has happened in our medical system, and people say, oh, we're moving toward socialized medicine. Well, who better than a physician to know that our system is already more than 50% socialized. And we see what we have inherited here. So we have a physician among a few others who are there to clean up a system. But above and beyond that, Dr. Price has been interested in a variety of issues that many of us, and certainly most in Congress, have never taken a look at. We talk a lot about the illegal immigration issue before our nation, but many forget the flip side of that coin, the legal immigration issue. Muhammad Atta, for example, was a legal immigrant into this country when he flew an airplane, and many of his colleagues flew other airplanes into buildings. Legal immigrants who had no business into our country, and yet we have needs for immigrants with skills that are needed in our society who can't come into this country and are taking their skills elsewhere. And it is I'm losing my, thank you. I'm still asleep. Who has awakened to that need when many others are focused on the more sexy issues that most American voters don't even see. We should be very proud and very happy to have serving in Congress a doctor who sees the breadth of issues facing our nation, and we're proud to welcome this morning in our midst Dr. Tom Price, Virginian and Congressman.
Thank you so much, Chris. Good morning to you. Great to be with you. I noticed that the table was shaking a little bit over here, and I wondered what it was. So I now recognize as I perked, Chris's interest perked up almost immediately when I said no, that my family was all from Roanoke, and I described how my namesake, Thomas Edmonds, was a lieutenant colonel in the American Revolution, and I finally got my lineage back to him in documenting that. So, Chris, I thank you for that warm and generous introduction. No offense to any osteopaths in the room, but I'm an orthopedic surgeon, proudly, and was, as Chris mentioned, raised in Michigan, did undergrad and med school at the University of Michigan, and then went to Emory University to do my training. Spent 20 years in the private practice of orthopedic surgery, and at one time in that period recognized that there were more people making medical decisions about what I could do for and with my patients in public policy in the state capitol and in the nation's capital than anybody I ever met in residency or medical school. And I said, as we say in Virginia and in Georgia, that ain't fitting. And I ought to do something about it. And so one thing led to another, and I was honored to serve 4 terms in the state Senate in Georgia, became the first Republican majority leader in the history of the state Senate in Georgia when we took over in '02, and then now serving in my 4th term in the United States Congress, representing the 6th District, northern suburban Atlanta, Newt-Soul District, for all of you who have been paying attention for a long time. And it's a wonderful place. It's full of all sorts of folks who want the government to stay out of their lives and out of their pocketbooks, which is a good fit for my representation. And I currently serve as the policy chair of the Republican Conference, the 5th in line in the leadership. It's been quite a ride. And folks say, why on earth did you get involved in this craziness? And I'm reminded of what Benjamin Franklin, the story about Benjamin Franklin that you all know so well, as he was leaving the Constitutional Convention, and reportedly a lady walked up to him and said, "Dr. Franklin, what did you give us, a monarchy or a democracy?" To which Dr. Franklin replied, as you well know, a republic. And then the 5 most important words ever spoken by Dr. Franklin: if you can keep it. If you can keep it. And I would suggest that we are in if you can keep it times. And it hasn't always been so. But this time, right now, in our nation's history, is one of those times when history will write whether or not we answered the call, we answered the charge, we answered the challenge, whether this generation stood up and said, no, not on our watch will you remove our liberty and freedom. We just won't allow it. And that's the kind of fundamental principle that I believe to be at stake, and it's the kind of fundamental principle that I believe is absolutely necessary to adhere to that will allow us to retain this greatest nation in the history of the world. Sometimes I get a little down in this run of trying to make certain that we've got a team in place that is able to withstand the onslaught of the Pelosi's and the Reids and the Obamas and the Matthews and on and on and on. But then something happens and I'm always uplifted. The good Lord doth provide, right? And what the good Lord did in this last congressional cycle and in this last election is send 87 new Republican members to the House of Representatives. Many of whom you in this room helped, and I thank you, thank you, thank you. 87 new folks who come to Washington with spit and vinegar and passion and enthusiasm and patriotism. They're inspiring in what they bring. And the 87 isn't the number that I find most intriguing. The number I find most intriguing is 37. 37 folks out of those 87 who had never run for anything in their life. Nothing. Maybe student council president, I don't know. But they'd never run for city council or county commission or state legislature or anything. And they, I believe, like you and me, at some point over the last couple of years, woke up and said, oh my goodness gracious, I can't believe what's happening to my country. What can I do? And for them, answering the call and answering the challenge in their district, what can I do meant to run for the United States Congress. And so it is incredibly inspiring to sit with these folks who, as I would meet them during the campaign in the last cycle, and I'd say, what do you want to do? What do you want to accomplish when you get to Congress? And most of them said, look, I'm not interested in doing anything. All I'm interested in doing is helping to save the country. They've come to Washington to save the country. And that's a different perspective than somebody who comes to Washington to make certain that they can get on an appropriate committee and get some kind of wonderful legislation passed. It's a different set of goals. And so you see all of that play out, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, about the budgeting process and the economy and the like and where we find ourselves. But before I do, I want to just mention briefly about this administration and what I believe to be a bankrupt administration on every single score. I don't know that you could find something that this administration is doing that isn't either in violation of fundamental American principles or simply wrong when you look at the facts of the matter. So when you look at the economy and spending, the rate of spending that's gone on for the last just the last 3 fiscal years for which they have been held some responsibility, $1.6 trillion in deficit spending, over $5 trillion in deficit spending in the last 3 years. A budget that comes out earlier this year by this president, I call it reckless leadership. It's vacuous leadership, actually. But a budget that comes out with the challenges that we have from a financial standpoint, and he refuses to even mention the issues, the real cost drivers in our economy right now, in our budget at the federal level, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Doesn't even mention them. It's not that he's got a bad idea. It's that he's got no idea. And that's the problem. We've got no leadership coming out of the White House. You think about what he's done in the area of energy. Big issues, huge issues, challenging issues. And what's he do? He goes down to Brazil and he says, we're going to help you and encourage you to drill off your shores as much as we can because we want, this is his line, we want to be your best customer. What kind of nonsense is that? And turn to the nation and say, we cannot drill here. We cannot utilize the resources that the good Lord has given us. You talk about vacuous leadership and health care. Don't get me started. My heart will stop. Obamacare is the poster child for an oppressive government that knows nothing about the fundamentals of how you deliver the quality health care to individuals. It is astounding. It is astounding what these folks have done. And so it's not just vacuous leadership or bad leadership, it's bankrupt leadership. These folks are driving our country off a cliff. And that's the good news is that the American people are waking up. American people are waking up. It doesn't even just happen on these shores. The foreign policy of this country. I think he probably thinks that he's raised the integrity of the country in some small corner of the earth somewhere. But I'll tell you, among the people that make a difference and the folks who are fighting for liberty and freedom and understand the principles that it takes to allow a free people to realize their dreams, they think this fella's out to lunch. He doesn't have a clue. I was dumbfounded. I'm always dumbfounded by this guy when he gets on television. Right? I was dumbfounded, and that's all the time. I was dumbfounded last Monday night, when he was going to give this major address on Libya. And so I got my cup of coffee and got in front of the television and said, oh, I guess I'll have to listen to him one more time because maybe he'll say something that makes sense. And at the end of that speech, I couldn't tell, that's never too late, that's right. I couldn't tell you anything about the fundamental principles of the United States and why we went into Libya, or if I were sitting somewhere else in this world, what is the policy of the United States? What's it based on? What kind of principle? It was a bunch of words relatively well read, only relatively, that didn't have any basis in fundamental principle. Every single day, on and on and on, we are subjected to a leader that is vacuous in his principle and vacuous in his policies and bankrupt of ideas that harken back to those fundamental principles that have made us the greatest nation in the history of mankind. That's the bad news. The good news is, because I'm an upbeat guy and I'm an optimistic guy, the good news is that the country has recognized that. There's a lot of buyer's remorse out there, in case you hadn't noticed, and people are fed up, and they have awakened. And the last, year and a half, 2 years, people have recognized that this was a terrible mistake, and so they're standing up, like those 87, like those 37 who had never run for anything before, most of them remarkably accomplished in their communities, and said, whatever I thought I was going to do with my life, something's changed. I'm going to have to answer the call. And so the country is now paying attention like never before, which is wonderful, because it will hold us to account to a much greater degree. Which brings me to the whole debate about the budget and the economy and jobs, which is still number one, way out there, because the American people understand and appreciate that the debt that this country currently holds is destructive to the ability of this nation, not just to be economically viable, but to be viable from a national security standpoint completely, and to be a moral country. You can't have this kind of dependency in our country and be a moral country. They're simply inconsistent. So when we talk about the budget and the economy and the things that Congress does, there are three issues that are kind of coming together all at once, and I want to touch on each of them very briefly. They are what I call the past, the present, and the future, right? Now, for my type A personality, logical mind, I think the past ought to be discussed before the present, ought to be discussed before the future, right? Because you got to have it in that order. That just makes sense. Well, the problem is that that's not what's happening in Washington in Congress, because the current debate is on the present, that is the continuing resolution. How do we pay for this fiscal year 2011, that ends September 30th of this year? It's kind of like fixing the train as it's riding down the track. The budget, the visionary, the future is coming front and center this week as we speak. So that's the ideal, right? That's how we put out our vision, how we would lead were we given the opportunity to control more than 1/6 of the federal government. Remember, that's what we're a minority party in Washington. We control 1/6 of the federal government. And then the next thing to come down the pike is the past, paying for the credit card, right? The debt ceiling. Bumping up against $14 trillion in debt or breaching that amount, which is just astounding, and figuring out what to do with that. So those three issues, you'd like to have them all come together in that past, present, and future order, but they're not. So here we are, having gone through two continuing resolutions to keep the government running, for the last 5 weeks, one of which saved $2 billion a week, $4 billion total. The next one, a 3-week continuing resolution, $2 billion a week, $6 billion, which is pretty good lick, right? $10 billion, not great. But remember, what we have available to us in the continuing resolution is the discretionary money, which is $378 billion for this fiscal year, of which we passed originally a savings of $61 billion. So that's about, my math isn't grand, but that's about 1/6. That's about 16%. We took a 16% whack at discretionary spending in H.R. 1. That's a pretty good accomplishment. Thank you. Right. Now, the reason that you and I and the pundits all get frustrated is because they look at $61 billion and then they look at a spending of $3.4, $3.5, $3.6 trillion, and you say, well, that ain't nothing. That's nothing. And you're absolutely right in the big scheme of things, which is why the budget that we introduced yesterday, and that I think has probably gotten pretty good press, and pretty good reviews, is that wonderful document that says this is what we would do were we given the privilege of controlling more than 1/6 of the federal government. And I urge you to kind of go through the budget. This is wonderful stuff. I mean, you talk about your legs shaking, it's wonderful stuff. Because if you think about the 10 top things that you want to do from a budgetary standpoint, whether it's block granting Medicaid back to the states, whether it's fundamental reform of Medicare, whether it's block granting food stamps back to the states, whether it's reform of unemployment insurance, whether it's attrition in the federal government, decreasing the federal workforce through attrition by 10%, on and on, whether it's decreasing taxes, broadening the tax base, and lowering the rate for everybody, whether it's being competitive in the world from a business tax standpoint. You can go on and on and on. And every one of those things you would say, that's a pretty good battle to have. Let's fight there. And they're all in this budget. They're all in this budget. So we get $6.2 trillion in savings over the next 10 years off of the president's budget. And we're not talking about an ideal and where we are. We're talking about the disaster of another Obama budget to come into place, and what is a document that I believe will stand the test of time and will be one of the things that historians will look back and say, this is when they got us back on the right track. This is when things got back on a course that recognized the wonder and the beauty and the awe that is this country. So I can't tell you how excited I am about this budget. I really am, and we're going to have a blast today in committee. We're going to move the budget through our committee. I recognized yesterday that Van Hollen, the fellow up in Maryland, who's their latest appointed talking head on their side to beat us up on every known thing. He came out before the budget was even introduced and told us that we were, shoving grandma off a cliff and withholding food from kids. And so I knew that they'd gone back to their old ways of not reading the bill. I knew that. They figured that one out. That was the way that they know how to evaluate legislation. First rule of evaluating legislation on the Democrat side is don't read the bill, right? And so that's what he did. But you'll hear all sorts of crazy things, and we're going to have a good time today moving that through committee. It'll be on the floor of the House next week. And I believe that we'll be able to pass what will be a stunning document in terms of vision about how we ought to move forward as a country. And then in the next number of weeks, we'll bump up against the debt ceiling. And the debt ceiling, remember, is the credit card. That's paying for past ills, $14 trillion in debt. And the rule that I have, is to make certain that if we raise the debt ceiling, which candidly we have to do. The American government cannot default on its debt. But if we raise that, then it must be accompanied by cutting up the credit card. We gotta put in place structural reforms to make certain that we change the culture of Washington. How does spending work in Washington? All of the inertia in Washington is to spend money. And we have an opportunity, because this has to become law, the raising of the debt ceiling has to become law, we have an opportunity to stand on ground that will fundamentally reform the system and make it so that spending isn't the inertia, that saving is the inertia. How do you do that? You can do it through a balanced budget amendment, a real balanced budget amendment, a spending cap to decrease, to hold to a limit, a spending control, to hold to a limit the amount of spending at the federal level based upon GDP. 20% is the number that gets bandied about. 18.5% is where we've been on average since World War II. If we were to do that and put in place triggers that if that's violated, then you cut across the board, you fundamentally change the system. And that's the only way I believe that we will accept, certainly the only way that I'll accept a debt ceiling increase. All of that being said, remember I mentioned that we are 1/6 of the federal government. We are the minority party in Washington. And I'm as frustrated as anybody in this room about the lack of speed with which we are able to accomplish things this year. Understanding that we are only 3 months into this, also understanding that isn't it wonderful to have a debate about how much we're going to cut and not how much we're going to spend? Isn't that something? And so what a wonderful difference an election makes. So I leave you with a challenge, and that is the challenge that the 2012 will be the most important election of our lifetimes. This country cannot afford, from any parameter you want to choose, cannot afford a second term of Barack Obama. It just can't afford it. And so I want to challenge you to do all that you can to make certain that Barack Obama is a one-term president, that we increase on our team, conservatives in the House of Representatives. The country sent 87 last time. I'm ready for 87 more, all right? So it's time to step up, and then it's also time to move and make certain that the Senate moves in a conservative direction. I believe after the next election, it is wholly possible, and this would be wonderfully changing for our country. I believe that it's wholly possible that the United States Senate will be more conservative than the United States House. You look at the people that are running, you look at the folks that we've got there, you look at the races that are up, it is wholly possible that the United States Senate will be more conservative from an ideological standpoint than the United States House. And because of the 6-year terms, you can fundamentally move the government. You can fundamentally move our nation in the right direction. So I challenge you to engage as never before. And most of you have been involved for a good long time, and I can't thank you enough. But it's time to engage as never, ever before. And sometimes you get a little frustrated, as I get a little frustrated, and then I always remember what Samuel Adams said, right? Remember? Everybody remember? It doesn't take a majority to prevail, but an irate and tireless minority keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men. I'm honored to stand with you and help set those brush fires of freedom. God bless you. Got microphones. There you go. Go Dogs.
2 questions, Congressman. The Ryan budget, if in a perfect world it was adopted, how many more trillions would it add to the national debt over the 10-year cycle? And secondly, how do you feel about welfare for farmers? $50 billion a year for farmers.
Yeah. Because of the cost drivers, with the baby boomers, you know, we got 10,000 baby boomers retiring every single day, or reaching retirement age every single day. 10,000. That's a big amount. We call it the pig and the python, right? You got a pig and the python. The python's got to eat the pig, and the pig's got to move through the python. And so what that means is that you continue to add to the debt for a period of time, and then by the end of the budget cycle, by the end of the 10 years, the percentage of debt is less than it is right now. So you'll hear people say, well, we're adding to the debt. I think it's $6 trillion, $7 trillion. And yes, that's the case. However, what we are doing is decreasing and getting us on that glide path to balance. This budget gets on a glide path to balance. If this budget were enacted by 2050, and that's a long way away, yes, but 39 years for many of us is not too long ago. We can remember it. I can remember 39 years ago very, very vividly. In 2050, we would have the size of the federal government be as the percent of the GDP going to the federal government be what it was in 1917. Hadn't been that low since 1917. This is huge, huge stuff. So does it increase the debt for a short period of time? Yes. But what it does is gets us on a path to balance, gets us to balance, and it does so without doing what most individuals who look at this situation believe to be political suicide, and that is not to grandfather the grandfathers. If we affect those individuals in or near retirement in the area of Medicare or Social Security, then that likely is politically just not doable. We can't, as a minority party, as we've recognized the last 4 years, you can't do a thing. So you got to be a majority party, and you got to do things wise. And what this does is send the signals to the appropriate individuals that America will get its fiscal house in order. We'll put things back on a appropriate trajectory, and we'll move to balance within the lifetime of certainly my kids and grandkids. Farmer question, look, the kind of corporate welfare, green welfare in addition to that, all the subsidies that we do, we ought to look at every one of them, and there's no reason that we ought to be, that federal money ought to be subsidizing things that ought not be subsidized, without a doubt. And you know, you think Ted Turner, who is the largest individual landowner in the country, I think, gets federal welfare. Gets federal welfare. Gets part of your tax money because he qualifies for some of the farm subsidies. It's unconscionable. Unconscionable.
You. Me? If we're going to make BL a one-term president,
Yeah.
The Republicans will have to put up a candidate. Do you want to express your thoughts as to what you see about the candidates that are
Sure.
common in the press today?
Sure. You know, I'm optimistic about 12, but I will tell you that this fellow is this is not going to be an easy race. This fellow is very adept at doing what he does best, which is campaigning. And leading he can't, but campaign he can. And so we have huge challenges. I think that the individual that will ultimately prevail on our side will be a person that will be up to the task. I think that the top, and I'll leave somebody out here, so I apologize, but I think the top numbers are probably Romney with the name recognition and the experience that he has. Newt from my old district is running, and I think Newt brings to the table a wealth of experience and ideas. The governors, I think there'll be at least one of the three governors that are looking at it right now that will rise out of the pack, either Tim Pawlenty from Minnesota or Mitch Daniels from Indiana or Haley Barbour from Mississippi. Any of those folks who've had great executive experience, I think, can show very, very well. I think John Huntsman is running, and there's a wild card that I don't know much about, but I think can energize folks. I don't think that Sarah's running. I don't know, but I don't think she is. I don't think Huckabee's running. I may be wrong on that one. Michelle Bachmann from the House is energized, and I think probably is, but I don't know. But I think of the top three that will come out of the initial run, it will probably be Romney and Newt and one of the governors, and Donald Trump. You know, as Donald Trump said to the Ron Paul folks at CPAC, that just ain't going to happen. You know. You know, Donald, I mean, he'll light it up, but I don't think the nation's ready for Donald Trump to be president of the United States. I'm sorry? Herman Cain's a great guy from Atlanta area, a fellow that I know well, a former president, CEO of Godfather's Pizza. He's got a wonderful enthusiasm and optimism. I just don't know how you, without the name recognition at this point and without the kind of money that a Huntsman would bring to the table, I don't know how you do that. It's possible, yes, but I don't know how you do that.
Yes, sir.
Stu Reuter, we're falling into the same trap that the media is setting for us, calling this the Ryan budget, as if it was created out of the whole cloth by one person. I assume you can dispute that. And the other question is, what are the realistic chances of this budget ever passing?
Yeah, and Paul is a dear friend and is really, embarrassed is the right word. I mean, he's a humble guy by the attention that has been given him with this budget. This budget has been a work in progress by many individuals for years, literally, and the work that's been done has the work on the committee has been inspiring because it's been everybody involved, and the give and take and the push and the shove and the to and the fro has been wonderful. Just inspiring, and we spent hours and hours and hours working on this budget. So that's, you know, the other side wants to demagogue somebody, and they need a target, and he just happens to be the target right now. I do think, however, he's a wonderful spokesperson for the budget. You talk about somebody that knows every dot and every number. He does, and as he describes himself, look, I'm just a wonk. You know, I'm just a wonk, and I love this stuff, and so he's the right person at the right time for this. So he would be distressed that it's become in the press what it has. The second question was? What are the absolute chances? Pass. Yeah. The House will pass this budget, understanding that the budget doesn't have to become law. Understanding that the last Congress, the Democrat Congress, didn't even pass a budget for the first time since 1974, which is one of the reasons that they could spend all that they spent, because there was no guidepost, right? There was no referee that said, no, you blew the whistle, you can't do that. They could spend all they want. So the House will pass it. We will bind ourselves to that which we can. And that which we can in this budget are the discretionary numbers. Those are the pre-Pelosi numbers. And we will bind our appropriations folks to those numbers. And we will do all we can on the mandatory side to get things changed. So the Medicare reforms, the Social Security reforms, the Medicaid block granting to the states, all of those things, we will do all that we can, which is the reason that 2012 is so important. You can't get these kind of truly visionary things accomplished without a cooperative, or at least a group of individuals on the Senate side who want to accomplish something, and a president who will sign the bills as they come across his or her desk. So no, the challenges are huge, but the House will bind itself. We will bind ourselves to those numbers.
George? I keep hearing 14 some trillion dollars being the national debt. But what about all of the IOUs
Yeah.
in the Social Security Fund
Yeah.
that did not get put into the national debt, nor get put into the lack of the yearly downfall? Can't you get that information out?
Yes.
I understand that the unfunded Social Security is 15.3 trillion.
Yes. Yeah. No, Mr.
Which makes our national debt twice what is.
Yes.
You
No, you're right.
said
Mr. George points out, and appropriately so, that the unfunded liabilities of this government are massive, and the number varies depending on how you count it, but it's somewhere in the mid-$70 trillion range this year, and it goes up because of the pig and the python. It goes up by an amount about $10 trillion a year, unless you get it in order, get things in order. And that's what's staring us in the face. That's why the reforms for those under the age of 55 have to be fundamental. This country cannot survive the current policies that are in place. That's why when you look at the president's budget and the track that we're on, it continues so that our national debt becomes within a relatively short period of time 800% of the gross domestic product. You just can't do that. And so you're right to point that out, and we get all of those in order in our budget. That's how fundamental the reform is in our budget. It gets all of those in order. Decreases over a period of time, and it takes a long time, there's no doubt about it, to decrease and do away with those unfunded liabilities that we have. But you can do it now. In 5 years, I don't know that you can even do it. I don't even know that the numbers add up without the kind of Western European or even worse austerity, the kind of taxation levels that we see in other countries, the kind of oppression on the ability of individuals to realize their dreams and embrace the loves and the passions that they have in life. That's where we are. We're virtually at that tipping point that people talk about. And some folks in here will know what that point is much better than I from an economic standpoint. But we're almost there. We're within a few years of that point where you can't get it back without major tectonic plate movement of what we are as a society. That's how important this budget is, this Congress is, and the 2012 election is.
All right, one last question.
Dr. Price, thank you for being here today. My friend Joe from Alpharetta met you last month in the, at one of the meetings. He said to watch out for you, and you've done well, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Many of us in this room remember the demagoguery that the Democrats have done, particularly around the 1980s when we did the welfare reform.
Yeah.
But there's, in the 1990s as well, but many of us don't remember that in this room. In a friendly way, I'd like to challenge this Congress, maybe challenge you and also Congressman Ryan, to come up with a 30-second soundbite or a 1-minute soundbite showing what they did years ago, that we were going to throw mom out, throw grandma out, and not feed the kids, because that's really the scare tactic on the other side. And I think if we can beat them to the punch, because we know it's coming,
Right.
then maybe we can pass this budget, maybe we can do things like
Yeah.
that. So I appreciate it.
Great point. Yeah, the demagoguery on the other side is really amazing. And people say, well, how can they do it? And the honest answer to that is that they're not bounded by the truth. They don't mind lying. We tend to be reticent to distort things, and it's a fault, yes. It's also a virtue. But they don't mind lying, and so they do. And so what you heard yesterday were mostly a pack of lies, and to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, who was much more diplomatic and correct than I, it's not that our friends on the other side are wrong or ignorant. It's just that so much of what they know just isn't so. And it's true. So much of what they know just isn't so. It's a great idea, and I'll take it back to our folks and see if we can't come out with something. I think the way to treat it primarily is mostly to point out that what they said was going to happen last time just didn't happen, one, but mostly with a sense of you got to be kidding. You're out of your mind. American people don't believe that. It's got to be a sense of humor. It's got to be a thick skin, a happy persona, an optimistic outlook on what America can be, and a visionary statement. And the American people are smarter than they give them credit for. I really believe that. I really believe that. So we've got our challenges cut out for us. There's no doubt about it. You do as well. But together, I promise you, together, we can get together in another couple of years and be rejoicing in adopting that budget and moving those mandatory changes forward so that we can keep for our kids and our grandkids the greatest nation in the history of the world. Thank you so much. God bless you.
We thank the Congressman so much for being with us. We want to present him with an Adam Smith tie.
Wonderful.
To help remind him every day the mandate that he has.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
very,
much.
very much.
Good.
I appreciate it. God bless.
You too can have an Adam Smith tie. It will cost you, however. And Kathy Graham. Kathy is in the back of the room. You can see Kathy about arranging to choose one of the several models available this year. Please join us for next month's Wake Up Breakfast on May the 4th. We're in our Georgia series. Tim Eccles will be speaking. You have a flyer at the table there. If there's anybody who'd like to tour the Leadership Institute, Seth Nichols is available to give you a tour. This Leadership Institute is expanding. There's a new building next door, and part of which is going to be ours, and I think there's a possibility that some folks could get a chance to go take a look at it if you've already had the benefit of this, looking at this building. Again, thank you very much. Go take care of America's business wherever you are. Thank you.